Putin was moulded in the KGB, weaned on espionage and counterintelligence, active measures, insurgency and counterinsurgency. It's no wonder that his worldview oozes paranoia and that he has no belief in democracy as a system or the idea of organic bottom-up revolutions. The war in Ukraine has shone a harsh light on an area of research that is undergoing a renaissance: counterinsurgency strategic studies. Today, I'm talking to David Ucko to understand this murky world of insurgency better and what the emerging trends are and how it can be weaponized by adversarial states and even bad actors within a society. David Ucko is professor and department chair at Caesar NDU. He is a program director with more than 2 decades of international experience in think tanks, academia, and government. His work focuses on political violence, conflict resolution, and strategy, topics on which he has published several books and policy briefs. Currently, David directs the Mobile Education and Training MET program of the College of International Security Affairs, a component of the US National Defense University and the Department of Defense flagship for strategic level education. David, you have a whole list of other associations. I don't know if you want to mention any of them or give reference to any of the institutions you also work with.
I think I'll just try to stand on my ideas rather than my past professional affiliations, see how that goes.
And of course, you've written some fantastic books, one of which I've been hugely enjoying this week, which is called The Insurgent's Dilemma, A Struggle to Prevail. I will be putting links to your books into the video description. So for the audience, do please check those out. There's some absolutely fascinating titles there. Well, let's get straight into the ideas. And this is a new area for me and something that I'm absolutely fascinated in already. What attracted you to it?
So there is this sort of sense in DC right now, in the United States strategic community, that insurgency is dead. And that's partly a sort of solipsistic reaction to the fact that we're no longer Afghanistan and limited presence in Iraq. But there's actually a broader truth to that statement, which is rarely realized, which is that the insurgent method that we see and that we associate with the term is not working anymore. And so what I wanted to do with this book is trace 3 adaptive insurgent approaches that I think have more purchase, more relevance in today's strategic environment. I wanted to do that because it seems to me that if we cling to this outdated understanding of insurgency, we're going to fail to realize the new ways in which democracy is under threat. Indeed, insurgency is adapting. Insurgency is realizing that the old methods won't bring the returns and the power that they once did during the Cold War. And I think if they are adapting, so do we. So that's the purpose of the book, to really, in a sense, predict what lies around the corner and to make sure that states who want to manage these areas of instability prepare accordingly.
And to give us a bit of that historical background, how has insurgency changed when you compare it to, say, the early to mid 20th century, through to the end of the century? What are we looking at here in terms of the evolution of it?
Yeah, so I think, the first point is that perhaps it hasn't changed quite yet, but it is undergoing a process of change. Sure, many groups out there are still going at it very much as we'd expect them to, following a sort of Maoist or Che Guevara-inspired theory of victory. That has to do with political military mobilization, guerrilla attacks, and then eventually veering towards the military overthrow of the state. But I think any review of their collective experience or success in this method will reveal a rather bleak track record. And so that's where I see the seeds of change. It's happening very gradually, and there are pioneers that are setting out new methods, new theories of victory with, I think, greater relevance, again, given the weaknesses of the state today, as opposed to those of our Cold War ancestors. So what are those changes? It seems to me that insurgents got stuck when they tried to mobilize a counter-state, or when they tried to, in effect, build up an alternative to the existing government. Because at that point, when they reach a certain level of seriousness and a certain level of structure, they become an easy military target for the state. And the state, most of all, likes to use military force against insurgents because it seems so decisive and it's so relatively easy, much easier than dealing with the political and economic and societal aspects that drive these problems. So we look at LTTE or the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka or ISIS in Iraq. It's really once they reach a certain threshold that they became, ironically, easier to counter militarily. So if that's where they get stuck, the ways in which insurgency is changing has to do with cloaking that military part of the struggle or restraining the use of violence below a particular threshold so that the state cannot use a militarized approach in response. It cannot rely on repression as a silver bullet, in effect, to keep the insurgency down. And that then requires a combination of other non-military efforts that have to take precedence. Violence still continues, but it's often shrouded in deception, in spin, and in subversion of the system.
Now, there's an interesting idea, I think, there, which is the economics of one state obviously trying to undermine another and either directly use insurgency in the the Russian way, the sort of little green men, a sort of hybrid methodology. But I guess another method is to actually support people or issues that are genuine grievances, people who are prepared to use violence to further their causes, but may get assistance from outside players. I mean, are those the two main types, or is it much more complex than that?
So I think what we saw during the Cold War, of course, both the Soviet Union and the United States were quite intent on sponsoring insurgent movements and giving them fairly advanced weaponry so they could combat the state. And again, this is why that method worked quite well back then. You'd have insurgent organizations that were armed and structured very much like the armed forces of a nation state, particularly developing nation state. That's not really how it works anymore. And so again, taking a cue from this insurgent's dilemma and the need to adapt, what we find instead are three alternative avenues that really form the core and the structure of my book, one of which has to do with the localization of the struggle. That is to say that rather than overthrowing the state in the capital, you locate and limit the insurgent struggle to key areas of the country that the state or the political or economic elite have anyway sort of given up on or don't favor as part of their political economy. And we can see how states have used this particular type of localization to fragment targeted states, whether it's the way in which Russia sponsored what you say, the supposed separatism in eastern Ukraine, or the same enclaves that it has taken in Georgia and also in Moldova. A second avenue has to do with infiltration. So again, rather than politico-militarily overthrowing the government, infiltration speaks to what Lenin, in fact, argued for way back in 1917, which is to say, use a combination of legal and illegal forms of struggle to undermine the state from within. It's very much a Trojan horse, if you will. And again, we can see the way in which Iran sponsors this infiltrative type of insurgency in Iraq, in Lebanon, and you can see Russian attempts of doing the same with its sponsorship of far-right movements in Europe. And then thirdly, I'm speaking about an ideational approach to insurgency, which basically, again, takes a struggle away from the physical domain, where these groups are so amenable to violent targeting, and puts them into a virtual domain of social media and internet mobilization. And again, you can see through the efforts of Russia and China with their bot farms or troll farms, that this is something where states, again, have been able to use levers of control to fragment states, to erode their legitimacy and create seeds of conflict. So I do think you're absolutely right there. There is a convergence between non-state and state entities around new forms of contestation, new forms of struggle. And I don't think we're really up to defending against those because we've retained an understanding of insurgency that's mired in this 20th century precedent.
And in the latter half of the 20th century, we did see an advance of democracy. We saw many countries tentatively making steps towards being more democratic, leading obviously to the prediction of the end of history. And we won't go into that because that's clearly not where we're at. But are democracies naturally at a disadvantage when these techniques are used by those that would seek to undermine them? Because the legal methods of insurgency, they have to tolerate them. They can perhaps crack down on the illegal ones, but to an extent, an autocracy doesn't need to worry about that. They can crack down on both legal and illegal dissent, as of course we're seeing in Russia.
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly when you speak about the infiltrative and the ideational methods of insurgency, they are particularly keyed to the vulnerabilities of a democratic system. Infiltration of a democratic system, of course, relies upon there being a competition of parties to begin with. You wouldn't see this method work very well in China or in any other one-party state. Even if the democracy is flawed or it's really an anocracy, so long as there is competition, there is sort of a way to operate above ground in the political field. That's where the infiltrative approach may work. And then, of course, democracies are also those, as you allude to, who will want to retain the democratic fabric of their state and who will want to protect the openness of the competition. And to say, therefore, that, oh, well, we don't like you, whether it's for good reasons or otherwise, you're not allowed to play, that harms the democratic fabric and becomes something that can be counterproductive very quickly. So we have to figure out the rules of the game, the rules of our own democracy, to ensure that we can protect it, all while we also honor its spirit. And on the ideational front, I mean, again, China has demonstrated very clearly what type of internet and what type of social media interaction it wants to see. We have talked about this a fair bit within democratic context, but we haven't really come to any decisions. It's still pretty much making up as we go along. And then again, there again, we see then the key vulnerabilities of a democratic society, because we are so torn on how to regulate online activity, online content, what the role of the state is, what the role of the platform is. And again, just this last week with Elon Musk, of course, this has become headline news once again. Arguably, we need a more strategic approach.
And before we go on to really unpack the different flavors of insurgency, which countries fundamentally are we talking about? We've heard here, China mentioned, Russia, Iran to an extent. Is this a widespread technique, or is it really those countries that are more on the autocratic side and have big geopolitical ambitions? Who are we talking about? Who's the biggest users of insurgency techniques?
I think for these, I mean, I think you hit on the usual suspects. And why is that? It is because they have this revisionist or counter-hegemonic agenda where they want to subvert the international order that was created after Second World War. And so how do you do that? Well, again, Russia, China, Iran, they were all created through successful insurgency. And they, more so than the United States, which was actually created in very similar circumstances, have retained a familiarity and an ease with in using these methods now on the international stage. Now, ironically, there's been a lot of talk within the strategic studies community about the Russian so-called Gerasimov doctrine, which has been vastly misunderstood and is not what it was often portrayed as. What it really spoke to was a Russian concern that America was using these very methods in sort of sponsoring color revolutions and thereby engaging or sponsoring it as sort of infiltrative insurgency in those countries. I mean, I happen to think that's empirically unsustainable as a charge, but it does illustrate that they're very keenly aware of the strategic potency of people power and the way in which external forces can definitely benefit if they can ride that wave.
And that talks a bit to the introduction, doesn't it? Because if you're someone like Putin, and I don't want to get too deep into sort of pop psychology, but if you're someone immersed in the world of counterespionage, if you are trained to be naturally paranoid and suspicious of everything, it's easy to see, isn't it, that if you're immersed in the process of creating insurgency, you might believe that there is no such thing as an organic revolution. There's no such thing as Maidan. There's no such thing as opposition. It tends to color your worldview somewhat.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I was researching this issue of infiltrative insurgency, it's very difficult to pass conspiracy theory and evidence. I mean, what is actually, it's covert form of operating. It's not meant to be seen. So even me as a researcher, I have to make sure that I don't get sucked in by the conspiracies that perhaps are more fiction than fact. And so, yes, it lends itself to a rather paranoid state of mind where you start, putting things together, drawing links between dots, and all of a sudden you can see pretty much anything that you want. So this is an issue, not least because, I mean, you mentioned the end of history previously. I do think that sort of a more charitable interpretation of what Fukuyama meant was that there is this, a yearning towards certain liberties, certain rights, certain abilities of self-expression, etc. And of course, if you look at that from a Russian perspective, you're going to think that there's a Western mastermind behind all of that, when I think it actually speaks far more to contending narratives, and one being far more attractive to the average person than the other.
That's it. And I was listening to a video earlier where we tend to think those values that you mentioned are the rule or the norm, but they haven't been for most of human history. In fact, the not having, really a value placed on life in the Western model is the norm. If you go back, a couple of centuries pre-Enlightenment, and I think it becomes very difficult, doesn't it, for us to put ourselves in the place of that sort of cynical mindset where individual life doesn't have the same value, where these absolutes that you mentioned are not necessarily, part of the air that's breathed, at least by the rulers. I know there's a small percentage. I mean, 20% of Russians would probably disagree because they've experienced some of those Western values and, of course, have fled to preserve their own lives. But there's a large majority of people who don't seem to think in that same fashion, certainly within Russia. I don't know about China and Iran. It would suggest that there are a lot of people yearning to perhaps change that framework of values. But I don't know what your thoughts are. And it's a bit of a generalized question there.
Yeah. No, but I think you hit on something very important. I mean, there is obviously now a crisis of illiberalism. And we see it in Iran with the protests. We see it in China with its absolutely absurd zero COVID policy and the disruption and illegitimacy that brings. And we see it clearly, of course, in Russia and everything that it's doing in Ukraine and beyond. So this is, I think, part of the same phenomenon. What I am as interested in, arguably more interested in as a citizen of the United States, is what does the alternative bring? What is, if it's a crisis of illiberalism, what happens to our own liberal society? And I don't mean that in a sort of weird way in which liberal has been interpreted in the United States as a party political term, but rather as a philosophical term, as a political theoretical term. And do we in fact offer something that is, to the independent observer, qualitatively better, qualitatively worthy of support and of sacrifice? And to what degree do we actually prioritize that? And this ties in, of course, to the national security strategy that the Biden administration just released, when they say, what comes next? We have to struggle, we have to strive to define that. Okay, so what's our vision?
I think that's a really good place to really start to dive into the different modes of insurgency. And we're going to start by unpacking the ideational insurgency. And what I'm really fascinated in here is, how does the tech environment we're seeing, the rise of the internet over the last 30 years or so, how does that create the environment for insurgency to thrive?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what it provides is a way to engage in virtual assembly in lieu of a physical assembly. Again, if you think back to the insurgent's dilemma that I detailed earlier, that is to say, the impossibility of really organizing and structuring your efforts without incurring military backlash, well, then organizing and assembling in a virtual domain, of course, avoids that problem. And this has long been an aspiration by any number of revolutionary thinkers. The neo-Nazi Louis Beam, for example, spoke of leaderless resistance. Abu Musab al-Suri spoke of individual terrorism. Both tried to find a way of mobilizing individuals without creating the structures that became a vulnerability when the state comes after you. It never quite worked. I mean, I think perhaps there were some tactical and operational gains. There were a few attacks here and there, but they couldn't really bring that into the strategic level. Now, with social media, with the ability to foster virtual links and virtual communities of belonging, the potency of this approach has been totally revolutionized. And I think, you look at ISIS, the way it has shifted from a physical caliphate to a digital or virtual caliphate, I think it speaks to that particular potential. And I think, again, it does raise some very difficult questions for the state, because we can't then bomb a digital caliphate to smithereens in the way that we did with what ISIS was trying to create in Syria and Iraq.
You can never quite wipe it out. It's like some kind of weed that will always pop up again in another place. And of course, you talked about the sort of type of content and platforms. ISIS is also a body of work, isn't it? It's videos, it's material, which once created, almost have an eternal life, so they could be revived at any point. And that goes for, I guess, any digital type insurgency. It's you can't do the traditional kind of whack-a-mole with it.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, even in the 1980s, what's interesting is that you saw some scholarship on these types of movements where authors realized very quickly how potent they would be. So I was fascinated to read the works of Gerlach and Heinz, writing in 4 decades ago on what they called segmented polycentric ideationally integrated networks, which I realize is a bit of a mouthful, but effectively what you're talking about is sort of like a flock of birds that are atomized yet connected, synchronized. And it's a bit like trying to, in responding to this, like punching a cloud, because you never know when the next attack is going to happen. And you never know exactly who your enemy is. And effectively, as you say, ISIS in particular has promoted a very participatory model of online engagement. And so every individual bird, to further the analogy, is contributing to the miasma of disinformation, of radicalizing content. And with each retweet and so on, it becomes almost impossible to control. Certainly there are methods, and we can get to those later. But again, we haven't quite figured this out.
And I think, I don't know if it's an example of this. I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on it. Once again, it's about sort of Russia and the sort of not GRU, or the Foreign Operating Service. I was speaking to David Satter, who I'm sure the author and journalist, who I'm sure you know. And he's firmly convinced that the Steele Dossier was a piece of active measures, that it was a traditional piece of espionage craft, but fitting in with a very, I would say, digitally oriented result, which is get your opponents to go at each other's throats. And this isn't necessarily, I'm not going to say this is all MAGA or all the left. In fact, it comes from the point of view that it doesn't matter who is who and what is what and who is right. If you can get the left and the right fighting each other over what they intrinsically believe to be right, then essentially you've won, and that is the purpose of it. And of course, that worked extremely well. You had much of the left taking the Steele Dossier at face value and delighting in it, because it was quite amusing in parts. And you had the right basically saying it was a smear and it wasn't true and it was made up. And to an extent, they may have been correct, correct for the wrong reasons, but correct nonetheless. Is that a sort of classic merging of older forms of insurgency with the digital sphere?
I mean, I think so, because what you're talking about there is the desire to accentuate the contradictions, to use sort of the Marxist/Maoist terminology. And clearly what you require then is a keen understanding of what the trigger points are. What are the vulnerabilities within our society that if you get at them, you're sure to create a sort of firestorm, a strong reaction. Clearly, and unfortunately, it's far easier to sow dissent and conflict than just to bring societies together. But for a state like Russia, this is straight out of their playbook. I mean, we have archival evidence from throughout the Cold War, where through active measures, they try to either sow dissent within countries or between countries, with stories of, the United States creating AIDS in a lab, etc. So this is a tried and tested method. And now, of course, it occurs not just in newspapers with fake items placed to sort of spin a particular narrative, but also then through social media, and the readers of this content also become the perpetuators of it. And so that adds another dimension, that once the cat is out of the bag, not only is it out of the bag, but it's also proliferating at an alarming rate. How do you put all those cats back into that bag?
And I mean, this is where it ties in quite interestingly with what I do for the day job, and that is marketing. And if I was to come up with a marketing campaign that had a life of its own, that is the gold standard of any marketeer to an extent, is to invest a relatively small amount of money and then have that self-reproduce in terms of attention, because normally you have to work incredibly hard to achieve these results. And is that one of the attractions of insurgency? That is it far more potentially effective and cheaper than, say, a conventional confrontation, or physical armies, or metal platforms?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And particularly, I think, again, coming back to this topic of ideational insurgency, take the hashtag phenomenon. If you can either find a hashtag that is already viral in its reach, and you just hijack the conversation and turn it into something that is not, you already have an audience that will automatically be receiving your messaging. If, on the other hand, through sock puppets or false accounts or bots, or even your own created apps, you could generate your own hashtags, all of a sudden you can create talking points. I mean, we talk about astroturfing in a sort of a social movement context. That is to say, the creation of false apparent popular fronts or popular movements. Well, you can create the same in the digital realm by effectively making it seem like everyone is talking about, everyone is accepting a particular storyline, a particular narrative, and it then generates a certain magnetic pull, not just because humans are curious and not just because humans want to know what's going on, but because the algorithms of these platforms reward that level of virality, particularly if they produce engagement, whether it's outrage, especially outrage, or support. And so, yes, this is a prime stage for mobilization and for polarization. And again, we have delayed our conversation as to what that means, where the line should be drawn and how it should be drawn between government oversight and private initiative, and of course, also at the end of the day, profit. Profit that's driven by ad revenue, that's driven by engagement, and those algorithms that, again, want us to spend more and more time on these platforms.
In a way, I mean, the only way around this is to potentially nationalize the platforms and remove the profit incentive from them to rejig the algorithm. But that's not going to happen, clearly. At the risk of inflaming our audience a little, I am going to use the alt-right and MAGA as an example. But for balance, the question I'm going to ask could easily be applied to any kind of bubble or digital universe that's created. It could apply to the hard left. It could be religious cults. It could be any grouping where you get almost the creation of an echo chamber of similar voices that reinforce your point of view and limited exposure to any points of view that challenge it. But could you describe a little bit how this ideational insurgency is playing out in the US, especially within the changes we've seen in the alt-right, since 2016 and beyond?
Yeah, no, absolutely. In fact, I think it is a very fascinating and disturbing case. We discussed a bit previously how ISIS used the internet to transition from a physical to a virtual caliphate, and they've done that fairly well. But to my mind, they are still hamstrung by the fact that they still want to create a physical space. Ultimately, that's their end point. And so as they move in that direction, they're going to have to figure out how to avoid the outcome that they saw in Iraq and in Syria and even in Marawi in the Philippines and anywhere else that they try to set up shop, which is that effectively, the drones are coming. The difference with the alt-right, and I use that term kind of like a heuristic, kind of like a shorthand, because really there is not so much structure and there's a lot of overlap between the different groupings. But the difference with then the alt-right is that they don't want to create a new territorial entity. What they're trying to do is change the United States and what it accepts as normal, its norms, values, culture, and so on, who belongs and who doesn't. And so they don't have the same obstacle in their theory of victory as ISIS has. And I would say they have been far more successful, therefore, because they've been able to use an ideational insurgency to change norms, to change values, and in fact make certain ideas that not long ago were deemed taboo seem almost mainstream, whether you like them or whether you hate them, and have to realize that they are nonetheless out there and you have to address it in some way. And so what does this look like? I would say that, the alt-right, ironically, has used a very similar method to ISIS. They've focused on online mobilization, online recruitment, online inculcation of talking points, and through the creation of online communities of belonging where people are indoctrinated, but also participants in a radicalizing network, you create almost certainly acts of violence. You don't even have to commission them, because that is, of course, where law enforcement starts taking a very active interest. But through dog whistles, ironic memes, hate speech, and othering other people, you create those angry individuals who take it upon themselves to change the world. And of course, we saw this most recently with the attack on Paul Pelosi. Now, the theory of victory underlying all of this is not new. You can go back to the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, who spoke of the need to erode the cultural hegemony of the system before you can change society. That you're basically knocking up against a brick wall until you start dismantling the norms and values that society holds. Similarly, the Breitbart magazine, the founder, who has passed away some time now, had this saying that politics is downstream from culture. And that's exactly what it's about. And so through online communication and interaction, you change the culture, and then you can change the politics. And so that ideas deemed toxic actually become accepted. That is, in a sense, a theory of victory. And I think, unfortunately, through a rather sophisticated strategy, which I'd be happy to discuss in closer detail, the alt-right has made a mark on American society. Of course, they've been helped by the ultimate amplifier in chief, which was the Trump presidency. But I think even on their own merit, they signal a type of insurgency that we're ill-prepared to counter.
And isn't that one of the real challenges? Is because, the tendency is to write it all off, is to look at some of the more contradictory sort of statements and acts of the movement and write the whole thing off. And yet it's driven by underlying grievance, which is true and which is real, and which perhaps is not being addressed in, say, the normalized or mainstream media. So you can't just root it out or ignore it. There are certain sort of truths there that are driving it, but then perhaps being translated into solutions that don't really align with the grievance that launched them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think so. So the internet has always been a meeting point for people, and one of the quotations, now I forget who said it in the book, is that at one point every village has had its idiot. It took the internet to bring them together, which of course is fun and fairly accurate as well, I guess. But actually, the problem is far more serious than just a bunch of idiots, because the issue is that when you bring them together, say, and when they organize, and when they're seemingly able to offer answers to other aggrieved individuals that mainstream authorities are not providing, then it is not only quite popular, but it's also contagious. And we need to actually address both the root causes, or what perhaps Emil Durkheim might have called the enemy that's driving this phenomenon, and the strategy that key people are actively using to tear apart society and to polarize it, to bring new ideas to the fore. I do think that at the heart of this lies a sense of relative loss for certain members of the white population of the United States, and a fear of losing the status that long has been bestowed upon particularly white men in America. And of course, how do you address that grievance? I mean, certainly, you could just say, well, put up with it. This is part of living in a globalized environment in a multicultural society. And yet, we may have to address also, find a different alternative solution for these people to express their grievance and to find some sort of response outside of gravitating towards violent extremist ideologies. Or we're just going to keep seeing this conveyor belt of violence, of instability, and polarization. So it's extremely tricky how you deal with this.
And we tend to see it as being new and shocking because it's happening in the moment. But if you look back at the the sweep of history, or the history of London is something I'm especially interested in. And every generation you'd have a peak in trade, and then you'd have a crash with very little social net, as it were, and you'd have extreme violence, riots. They burn stuff down en masse, horrific stuff, which even the 6th of January pales in comparison to some of those historical sort of outbursts. But the difference here, isn't it, is that it gains longevity because it's recorded and amplified, actually not through digital media alone. Certainly in the US, there is a traditional media, as you mentioned, sort of Breitbart. There, of course, is Fox and the sort of slightly more extreme equivalents of Fox. And to some extent, points of view that are being expressed there have emerged from, say, the dark web, where they could only exist a few years ago in the dark web underground. They're now to be seen in the mainstream, and to an extent that starts to validate the online extreme points of view. Is it almost like a kind of feedback loop that's taking place here?
Yeah, that's exactly the point, to trade up the chain. And so, again, neo-Nazis in the US and elsewhere, for that matter, were pioneers in using bulletin boards and early sort of primitive gathering spaces online to, sell music or merchandise or whatever. And that's obviously not great, but it's also in itself self-contained. The difference here that I explore in the book in terms of ideational insurgency is that the problem doesn't end with the so-called digital counterstate. That is to say, those areas online where the hardcore, the mass base meet and reinforce one another and validate one another's conspiracy theories and scapegoating. If it was just about that, that'd be one thing. But as you put it, it's now going mainstream. And I think that's absolutely deliberate. One of the key policies or policy terms that's animating this movement is the notion of an Overton window, which doesn't really have a lot of content to it. But basically, the idea is that you got to change what a society deems acceptable, that which is within the window. And that you do that not from top down, not through politicians coming in and telling society what's what, but from societal mobilization informing official policy. And so what is typically in the trade called red pilling the normies, that is to say, getting normal people to buy into the ideology, to view the world completely differently. That is a key driving component of the strategy. And this involves going beyond the digital counterstate and attacking mainstream platforms like Twitter, like Facebook, like YouTube, like the comments section on any news item, wherever it might be, to always bring these alternative talking points to the fore. And of course, for people who are not supporters of this, you have two options. Either you engage with it, which is heightens the engagement and the algorithms reward that, and all of a sudden it actually becomes more visible, or you ignore it, in which case you allow those talking points to remain unchallenged. And that's a key dilemma. And so we saw from 2012 to 2016, there's a proliferation of white nationalist movements online. A 600% growth in followers among some the main accounts. And the idea was, again, to bring these talking points to areas and to fora where ordinary people will hear it, somehow or another become desensitized to the racism, bigotry, misogyny, or what have you, and start believing that, hey, maybe it is the other's fault that my life is not as I want it to be. Maybe it is their fault. And maybe it is political correctness that's holding us back from realizing what the situation is really like. And then you have to deal with that. And now you have a very politically radical voter base. And I would say the right wing of the party has this problem far more than the left wing. I don't think there's any real equivalence there. And that has very potentially harmful effects on the democratic fabric, because we've now entered into the realm of populism and of post-truth.
And to that extent, I think we're going to launch into the next insurgency type. But in the context of what you said, can January the 6th be seen not as an aberration, but as a stepping stone or a marker on what potentially could be a series of insurgencies? And what type of insurgency would you class that as?
Yeah, actually, I mean, it's a fascinating question, because with January 6th, in a sense, what you see is I wouldn't say it's a culmination, but I think it's a punctuation, a key punctuation in the ideational insurgency that had been brewing. The COVID years, we're all sitting at home in front of our computers. A lot of people started getting very, one, aggrieved, and one, very desperate for easy answers to complex questions. And so what you see then, along with the conspiracism of the Trump administration as relates to the election, was just this outpouring of anger. And January 6th, then, what you see, it's not one group, it's not one insurgent movement, it's like a conglomeration of different groups with overlapping membership, catapulted forward on the back of ordinary Republican voters. And so the dividing line becomes difficult to see, even though there is one. And of course, normalizing all of the talking points and also the reliance on violence against the system to make political change. So this I think was an extremely menacing moment for the United States. I wrote the book shortly in the aftermath of that attack, and I have to say I sort of concluded the study of far-right white nationalism in the United States at that point. I didn't realize to what degree they were shifting already then into more of an infiltrative insurgency. And what do I mean by that? It has to do effectively with, rather than attacking the Capitol, entering the Capitol through institutional paths, through the electoral process, but doing so not on the basis of an open and fair democratic competition, but in fact by gaming the system. And we've seen the threats of violence against voting locations, against voting officials that, that are intent on actually certifying the results as they are. We see the violent rhetoric, and we see, of course, the way in which part of this movement are trying to fill the positions that would then validate future elections down the line. Now, in calling this an insurgency, of course, I have to be a little bit careful, because a definitional marker of insurgency is the use of violence. Now, do we see that violence? And is that violence commissioned or coordinated by the types of individuals that I'm speaking to? That seems to be a key definitional, a key political point, because it's very dangerous to miscast political parties as insurgents until you have evidence of foul play. I would say that, again, it's very difficult to draw that line, but there are certainly troubling indications of what's going on. The fact that you have people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, and she's not alone, making threats of violence, advocating for taking out their adversaries. You have the very open carrying of arms at voting locations. You have what's called confrontational politics, that is to say, a whole school of thought that advocates non-stop harassment, intimidation, and bullying of political rivals to drive them out. Again, it is ambiguous. It is difficult to sort of say clearly what's going on, but it worries me that that ambiguity may actually be deliberate rather than the product of a lack of evidence. But here we come back to the previous point that we discussed. You have to be careful that you don't get sucked into your own conspiracy theories. But this is an element that strikes at the very heart of American politics and is so parochial and so partisan that it's almost impossible for anyone to muster the legitimacy to address it appropriately. And so it just festers.
And the other challenge, isn't it, is it doesn't have to be overt violence, which everybody can see. If it's behind closed doors, if it's implied violence, if you don't write it down or record it, then who's to say, it actually happened? You can't prove it. And I think that's one of the real challenges of critiquing Putin's regime until it entered this hot phase, which was fairly overt and direct and everyone could see it. It existed as a informational autocracy. And a lot of the terror is implied. A lot of the coercion is implied, built into the system, into the relationships. People just instinctively understand that these are the rules, this is how it works. So you can have an enlightened constitution, you can have everything can appear above board on the surface, but it has been, coerced or perverted behind the scenes with that sort of intrinsic sort of terror and threat. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, that's one of the key points when I speak about infiltrative insurgency, It is that, yes, you absolutely want to behave like a political party, and you absolutely want to create bridges across society and come across like a legitimate social movement, because those are the appearances that will save you from outright repression. Repression is too costly politically when it seems to be targeted at an innocent party within society. However, the difference is that these infiltrative insurgents maintain the use of violence, but as you say, not in an overt way, not in a way that's attributed to the group or allowed to sully the party, but rather in a way that is clandestine and operates below a particular threshold, where it can do what it needs to do. It translates and communicates clearly the effects, the message, don't mess, get out of the way, but it doesn't sully, again, the reputation of the above ground enterprise. And analytically and certainly programmatically, we're not very well equipped to deal with that coexistence of licit and illicit efforts. We tend to think of insurgents as being extra systemic, not as being, within our own heart of government. But there is ample precedent for precisely that approach, going back even to Hitler's own national security and his DAP, where he effectively used a party and what he called a parliamentary path to seize power, all while relying on militias and armed elements to scare off the opposition and to intimidate and bully possible dissenting voices. You can also look at the way in which the IRA in Northern Ireland used Sinn Féin as a political proxy to, in fact, do the above ground stuff, all while IRA continued their battle below ground. And even Golden Dawn in Greece, for example, which was able to, within the context of a democracy, organize a fascist militia and actually have it orchestrate violent attack, all while the political wing was sitting in government. So this is not new, it is not unprecedented, but it's a form of insurgency that we haven't really paid a lot of attention to, because again, we think of insurgency as a very militarized, extra systemic challenge. It's far more complicated than that.
And that ties in very interestingly with my smattering of knowledge of Russian history. And there's a form here of administrative insurgency, isn't there? Which I think you've partly described there. And of course, Stalin actually came to power not as immediately that sort of iconic figure. He was actually a grey person in the background, but as the chief administrator, as the general secretary of the party, he knew where all the skeletons were buried. He knew how the system worked. He knew how to threaten people, lean on them, bribe them, make that system work in his favor. It was many years before he really came out front, until he'd completely taken over that administrative system.
Yeah, I mean, you speak to something very important here, which is the tendency, or rather the fallacy, that marks our study of terrorism and political violence. We tend to measure these things in terms of the number of people who are killed or maimed, or maybe how many people of theirs we kill or maim. When, of course, terrorism is just a mechanism of political communication, and you can communicate the terror, intimidation, and the threat of force without actually engaging in outright violence. Now, does that mean that it ought not to be criminalized, that it ought not to be regulated? Well, there you get into these murky conversations. And so, for example, from Afghanistan, just take one illustration. The Taliban used to deliver night letters to, communities of people whom they wanted to target, basically saying, if you're here in the morning, we're going to kill you. And people thought that threat was credible. And so people reacted accordingly. No violent act, and yet violence was hovering in the wings. And again, if you know the system, if you are credible, and if you can send the right messages, you can have a terrorizing effect without engaging in terrorism. And you shield yourself behind the notion that you're not a violent actor. You say, well, there is no commission of a crime here, sir. And of course, that again forces us to consider ethical and strategic pitfalls of response, and requires a far more, it's shrouded in ambiguity. And you see, whether it's Russia engaging in Ukraine, or whether it's the alt-right engaging in the US, that weaponization of ambiguity is becoming far more pronounced, and it requires a far more careful and deliberate conversation in knowing how to counter it.
And to an extent, I mean, taking the Russian example, I was watching intently through 2019, and clearly it was escalating in a way that was difficult to find where it was actually going. But there was clearly an escalation because there were many opposition figures, including journalists, satirists, and so on, who were leaving the country. And I listened to videos of quite a few of them talking, and it would go like this, oh, I met someone who's got connections with the administration, and they said to me that certain people have made hints or threats or advised that you should leave now before it's too late. And that form of a sort of internal Chinese whispers is quite effective, and many left the country. Of course, a few like Ilya Yashin and Navalny himself decided on the basis of those threats, either physical or implied, to actually return. But most left. And I don't think they should be condemned for doing that. But it's extremely effective, isn't it?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, in the context of the midterms that just happened, if you look at some of the threats that have been delivered both online and otherwise to voting officials, saying, you stole our effing election, and we're coming for you. The Second Amendment is going to be, you won't hear us coming. These we've had also from past elections, concrete evidence of death threats and of harassment and bullying. And of course, people are human. People are families. People want to take care of their own. They don't want to die. They don't want to live in fear. So people do what they need to do. And again, what is the crime? Where do you draw the line between freedom of speech and actual threat? And of course, freedom of speech stops short of active threats. But again, who's making the threat? How do you unravel the anonymity at the heart of this particular approach? And again, even with something, I don't know if you recall, but on Twitter some years ago during the height of the Trump administration, the alt-right started putting triple parentheses around names and businesses whom they thought were Jewish, as a way of basically putting a gold star on their lapel, and then singling them out for horrendous abuse and cyber attacks. And again, who is responsible for that? How do you counter it? How can government do it? Can the platform do it? And particularly, how do you prove the malicious intent? Some people said that, oh, no, this is just something that we want to do to mark the global reverberation of Jewish ideas, something to that effect, some bullshit excuse, frankly. But again, it's kind of becomes he say, she say. They have weaponized the vulnerabilities of our society, of our digital society, in a way that our regulation and our policy has not caught up to.
And taking that idea to an even more extreme level and using the US as an example, what institutions would need to be degraded? Which checks and balances removed in order for the insurgency to reach some kind of tipping point?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a school of thought out there for how to counter infiltrative attempts at insurgency, or the use of democracy by anti-democratic elements, and has to do with militant democracy. That is to say, many states have it written in their constitution that, say, in Germany, if you're a Nazi party, you're not allowed to play. Or if you're in Ukraine and you're a communist party, you're not allowed to play, etc. And that can obviously work as a defense mechanism. But the problem is that a central component of the attack here has to do with duplicity, ambiguity, and subterfuge. So it's not as if they come out of the gate saying, hi, we're a Nazi party. And then you have to then get into the evidence of the issue. So the institutions that can help you navigate that road are precisely those that are also targeted, particularly then if we combine the ideational approach with an infiltrative one, such as the judiciary. If you politicize the judiciary, clearly you have no independent arbiter to say what's what. And then you're living in this post-truth environment. The press or civil society has to be silenced or discredited so that they can't have a correcting influence on this post-truth environment. And that's fairly easy to do because unfortunately, they are subject to intimidation, attack, or otherwise, and are not able to defend themselves very effectively. Social movements need to be created or co-opted. so as to make it more difficult to move against a group, given its local standing. The notion is that if you move against them, you're going to have a political firestorm on your hands, and that then delays or deters any action. And then, of course, ideally, a key institution that's ultimately targeted is the law enforcement or security services. And rather than engaging in pitched battle, far more effective than to weaken it or to corrupt it, and to ensure that in effect you have allies within those institutions. And of course, one of the more disturbing things that came out of the 6th January attack was just how badly infiltrated the armed forces were by this very noxious white supremacist ideology. So, if you are able to engage in that, in that long march through the institutions, as one famous German Marxist ideologue put it, then you have set up a nice path for sustainable political power in a way that can occur without even, the Dien Bien Phu or the conventional attacks with which we used to associate insurgent struggles for power back in the Cold War.
Well, now I think we've gone through the main types of insurgency. I think we're entering the home straight, as it were, and really the last area of focus I think we're going to hit on is what can democratic societies do to protect themselves or even inoculate themselves if insurgency is almost an inevitable part. Now, a little bit like you can't get rid of viruses, but you can in some way protect yourself against the worst effects of them. What can we do really to guard against and protect ourselves against successful insurgency?
Yeah, so if we begin with the notion of ideational insurgency, that is to say the weaponization of internet and social media to shift and abuse norms in society, to bring in very populist ideas. I mean, there are different avenues, and I explore, half of my book is devoted to strategic options, if you will, for countering these things. Clearly, the violence that's associated with this strategy is a ripe target for law enforcement. The problem is that it's very difficult to predict. And once the violence has occurred, yes, you can arrest people if they're still alive, but it doesn't really have the deterrent effect, it seems, that we'd want it to. So we need to get more sort of anticipatory intelligence here, which of course leads us to sort of a minority report environment where how can you predict crimes? You can do by penetrating society increasingly with intelligence and with law enforcement. That's very risky because then all of a sudden you're talking about civil liberties being impinged upon, and where do you draw the line effectively? Already in the wake of 9/11, many European countries in particular have extremely tight legislative frameworks for counterterrorism. Do you really want to go further in that direction? It's possible, of course, to prescribe entire groups. So, for example, the Proud Boys have been prescribed by Canada, and that's great. But it doesn't really hit at the very amorphous nature of this problem, the fact that you don't really have set structures, or at least they're very fluid. And then perhaps another way to do this would be to actually engage with what they're saying rather than who they are. But that, again, gets into freedom of speech issues. Now, one alternative there is that you basically rely upon the platforms to regulate these things, because they can do it not because it's not allowed to be said, but because those terms of service that those platforms use don't allow it. And so you don't run up against constitutional barriers. The issue here is that both Twitter, or at least until recently, Twitter and Facebook have been very loud and clear in proclaiming their successes in terms of deplatforming. The problem is that they're not really catching the gray content. I mean, they're great at getting the most obvious things, and there's plenty of stuff they've taken offline. The gray content, that is the stuff, say, the more ambiguous things, the jokey things, the irony, the memes, or even just the sensation of belonging that you get from engaging with a particular community online that perhaps mostly just laughs about these things or just discusses them or whatever. It's difficult to control those things. And so, in a sense, we are getting most of the obvious content down, but we may be missing the most critical one. And then the separate problem, of course, is that whereas Twitter and Facebook could, with their resources, police the sort of hallways of cyberspace, many other platforms will not. And so you have this problem of, what kind of loopholes will be remaining. So in a sense, if that's maybe a promising start, but not quite enough, the other prong here would be to say, okay, we can't really target the doers, we can't really target what is being said. How do we target the audience, those who are hearing these things? How can we inoculate our society against these noxious ideas? And there are various efforts to foster both individual and societal resilience, whether it's counter messaging, or what has been the prevent policy in the UK, or preventing violent extremism, countering violent extremism, and so on. The problem here is mostly one of trust and legitimacy with the key audiences that matter, because ultimately you're relying upon the government's ability to reach into pockets of the population that are not only very difficult to find, but also they won't necessarily want the government to tell them what to think in the first place. Anything the government says to them in terms of, hey, maybe you should think about changing your trajectory in life, will be outright rejected, most likely. And so we've had some anecdotal evidence that this works, but I don't think that we've been particularly systematic in understanding what exactly preventing violent extremism ought to look like, or how we measure success, and how we make sure that we don't score just a variety of different own goals. Certainly when it was Al-Qaeda and ISIS, the way in which we framed the entire sort of Muslim population as potentially complicit, or at least a source of the problem, was clearly deeply unhelpful, because it stigmatized the religion rather than highlighting the key individuals and small level networks that were at the heart of the problem. Similarly, you can't tar the 74 million people who voted for Trump as being the source of the problem, but you also know that people who identify as MAGA activists are those who are going to be the issue. So you got to make sure that you frame it in a way that doesn't actually compound the alienation that population already feels. And then finally, there is also this program of media literacy, the notion that in this environment, we need to work towards understanding how to use the internet, making sure that we are inoculated against the most extremist messages, not just for the people who are, say, in vulnerable positions, but for everyone. This is a democratic duty. The problem there, again, is that I think that can do a lot of good, but when society cannot agree upon what constitutes a trusted authority or what constitutes truth, how do you then train someone to triage sources or to be critical thinkers? Because it seems to me that you won't agree on what constitutes a reliable source. I might think the New York Times is a reliable source. Someone else think that's government or extreme left propaganda. How do I convince them that my set of sources are better than theirs? If you already have that cleavage in society, I don't know exactly. I think you have to get a deeper level of reform than media literacy in and of itself can provide. So that's what that. Yeah.
I think studies, I read a study that showed as well that, if you ask someone to critique a piece of propaganda which is not aligned with their own beliefs, but it's, the beliefs that they don't hold, then they can be reasonably objective, and it's shown they have a far higher level of understanding of critiquing those sources. So to an extent, that sort of information bias or that bubble bias isn't just a problem on the right, is it? It's that everyone, to an extent, is informed by their biases and less able to critique material that agrees with their point of view.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's confirmation bias, and we see it again and again in psychological studies. And there's an added dimension in the United States right now, which makes this even more complicated, which is that we are so polarized that the discussion has become zero sum in a just fundamental way. That is to say that even for people who consider themselves sort of, peaceful, law-abiding individuals, have put up a barrier against anything or any talking point that might inadvertently legitimize the opposition. And so the level of tribalism and the level of polarization, I don't think has ever been so bad. And how do you, in a sense, engage with the other and peel away potential pockets of support for extremism if you have no common ground that you can share with them? If you can't compromise on anything, if you give an inch, they'll take a mile, and so we're not going to give an inch. That is not a very auspicious way to deal with a pluralistic and sort of politically diverse country such as the United States. Unfortunately, that's exactly where we are.
And Ukraine has struggled, I think, with many of those issues, and I think it perhaps points its way, not necessarily for a solution to everyone or even to the US, but I've talked to a lot of sort of Ukrainians, and they have huge campaigns for media literacy. I think many people who've been involved in, say, setting up fact checking or other more overtly or slightly sort of aggressive techniques, which have their role, but I think find that they have relatively little impact overall. If you counter negativity with more negativity, that doesn't really work as a technique. So many of the people I've spoken to say, well, the first thing is clearly define your values and then stick to them. Don't betray your values, and that will certainly help. Combine it with media literacy. But I think the unspoken one, of course, in Ukraine is that there has been a process of cultural nationalism. I see that as a positive factor, in fact, but you're looking at a multilingual, multicultural, very complex society with a lot of trauma. And to an extent, the move towards a rediscovery of whether it be sort of literature or other cultural identifiers, and of course that does have its extreme angles as well, but that also seems to be quite a strong counterweight to the forces that are tearing society apart. You now have a lot of people whose primary language is Russian, and they are starting to learn Ukrainian. They have a far clearer sense of belonging to a certain cultural identity and moving away from traditionally what was described as, say, the Russian world.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's miraculous to see really how Ukraine has unified in the face of crisis and been able to muster this response that I think has just wowed the entire world. One might have thought that an insurrection at the Capitol, egged on by a then recently outvoted president, would have been the crisis that might have galvanized a similarly unifying force in the US. But sadly, we haven't seen that. And to the contrary, if you look at the pulse of how this is interpreted, it very easily falls down across party lines, with the right wing polling quite high, saying that this was a legitimate thing, or it was not actually us, it was, Black Lives Matter or Antifa or something, again, relying on conspiracy theories. And unfortunately, we haven't gone over that. And I don't know what the crisis will be that could, in a sense, unify this country again. It's very difficult to see. These midterms that we're still counting the results of could very well corrupt the democratic fabric of this country to an irredeemable extent. At which point, people have talked about death of democracy. It's not unheard of. It's not unprecedented. I'm currently reading an excellent book by Moises Naim, talking about the revenge of power, and he talks about a 3P policy of polarization, post-truth, and populism. So this could happen here, and I in a sense, I don't see what would change the trajectory. There may be a lot of violence ahead before anything like that happens, unfortunately.
And on that note, that's obviously an extremely pessimistic note to end on. But I guess if you have a clear understanding of what the undercurrents are, then maybe that gives a chance to perhaps tackle them. I know we're sort of out of time. I think there's probably a ton of things we could still unpack and discuss, and maybe we'll hold that up for a future episode. But for now, David, you've been incredibly generous with your time and in the preparation of this episode, and it's hugely appreciated. And it's been tremendously stimulating talking to you.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, obviously, this is a topic that I find very interesting, but I go back to where we started, which is this notion in the United States or in DC, particularly in the strategic studies community, that insurgency is dead. I think that we've illustrated quite clearly in the last hour that that is clearly not the case, and that we in fact have to think far more closely and far more deliberately about the nature of this problem and also how to respond.
And to anyone watching this video, do pick up on David's books, because that will give you a lot more information, a lot more understanding of some of the issues we've tackled today. David, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the opportunity.